September 19, 1944, dawn broke cold over the French countryside near, the fog hung low between the trees thick. Enough to taste, in the distance, the rumble of engines, German engines. Panzer engines, the sound every American tanker had learned to fear. Inside the command post of Combat Command A, 4th Armored Division, Colonel Clarke stood over him. Table, his intelligence officer had just delivered news that made his blood run cold. 5th Panzer Army, 262 tanks, Panthers. All of them rolling toward his position. Clarke had fewer than 90 Shermans. Mathematics were simple. The outcome seemed inevitable, but what happened over the next 11 days would change everything the American Army thought it knew about tank warfare, and it would force the Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower to confront a truth that his own ordnance experts had been hiding for months. The Sherman tank, America's armored workhorse, was, and according to every technical specification, outmatched, yet somehow in the fields and forests of tankers were about to prove that wars are not won by specifications alone. If you're interested in the untold stories of World War II, the tactical innovations that changed modern warfare, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you the history that textbooks forgot, told with the respect these veterans deserve. The story begins not at but 6 weeks earlier in the hedge of Normandy. July 1944, the Allied breakout from the beaches had finally begun. Operation Cobra had shattered the German defensive line, and American armor was pouring through the gap. For the first time since D-Day, tank commanders could see open country ahead. This was what they had trained for. This was what the Sherman was designed to do: exploit, pursue, advance. But something was wrong. In the narrow lanes between the hedge, American tank crews were dying, not from artillery, not from infantry, from other tanks. German tanks that could kill a Sherman from 2,000 yards, while the Sherman's 75-gun bounced rounds off German armor at 600 yards. Tanks with names that would haunt American soldiers for the rest of their lives: Tiger, Panther, King Tiger. Major Rose, soon to command 3rd Armored Division, sent a report to Eisenhower that summer. The language was clinical, the message was desperate. He had personally observed American 75 and 76 rounds bouncing off the frontal armor of Mark V Panther tanks at 600 wide. Meanwhile, the Panther's long-barreled 75 could penetrate a Sherman's plate from beyond visual range. Rose was a professional soldier. He chose his words carefully, but between the lines, anyone could read the truth. American tankers were being sent into a knife fight with a butter knife. Eisenhower received the report in his headquarters outside London. He read it twice, then he picked up the phone, called his chief of ordnance. The conversation was brief. The tone was not, "Ordnance told me this 76mm gun would take care of anything the Germans had." Eisenhower's voice was steady, but those who knew him recognized the Benice. "Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." The ordnance chief tried to explain. Testing had shown the 76 was adequate. The problem was the testing. They had fired American guns at sections of American armor plate configured to approximate German tank dimensions. They had never actually tested against a real Panther. They had never needed to. German tanks had been rare in North Africa, rare in Sicily. Even in Italy, tank versus tank combat was uncommon in the mountains. But France was not Italy. France was tank country, open fields long. And the Germans were no longer running. They were defending, which meant they could choose the ground, choose the range, and at range the Panther was king. Eisenhower ordered every captured German tank brought to testing facilities, England and later in France. He wanted serial numbers recorded, arm thickness measured, penetration tests conducted. He wanted to know exactly what his tankers were facing. More importantly, he wanted to know if his own intelligence estimates were accurate. They were not. British and American intelligence had estimated German tank production at around 1,400 tanks per month in 1942. Statistical analysts, using a new method based on serial numbers from captured vehicles, calculated the real number: 246 per month. The Germans were producing far fewer tanks than Allied intelligence believed, but the tanks they were producing were far more lethal than anyone had predicted. The Panther tank weighed 45 tons. Its sloped frontal armor was 100 mm thick, angled at 55, giving it an effective thickness of 140 mm. Its 75 mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 mm. The Sherman weighed 30 tons. Its frontal armor was 81 mm, barely sloped. Its 75 mm 3 gun could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor even at range. On paper, the Sherman was dead before the fight began. But war is not fought on paper, war is fought by men, and in September 1944, the men of Third Army were about to teach the lesson in combined arms warfare that would echo through for the next 80 years. General George S. was many things: a student of history, a believer in speed and aggression, a tank officer since 1918, and contrary to popular belief, he was not unaware of the Sherman's limitations. He knew his tanks were, he knew they were, but understood something that many critics then and now did not grasp. Tanks do not fight tanks, armies fight armies. By early September, Third Army had raced across France faster than any army in American history, 300 miles in 2 weeks, liberating towns. Faster than maps could be updated, the Germans were reeling, disorganized. And then the fuel ran out. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, had to make choices. Montgomery's 21st Army Group needed fuel for Market Garden. The air operation aimed at crossing the Red Ball Express could not supply. Everyone's advance stalled east of, just short of the German border, and that gave the Germans time to reorganize. Time to bring up reserves, time to prepare a counterattack. Fifth Panzer Army, commanded by General, one of Germany's most capable armored leaders, his mission was clear. Destroys bridgehead across the Moselle River, recapture Nazi, push the Americans back. Himself had approved the operation. 2 panzer brigades, the veteran 11th Panzer Division, over 250 tanks, many of them Panthers fresh from the factory, against them, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, 90 tanks, most of them Shermans with 75 guns. Germans attacked at dawn on September 18, 1944. The 111th Panzer Brigade, equipped with new Panther tanks, struck toward the town. Of the plan was textbook: bypass the town. If necessary, drive north to cut off the American salient, destroy the 4th Armored Division. What the Germans did not know was that their Panther crews had received 2 weeks of training. Most could not read maps. Their commanders had no experience coordinating armored operations. The Panthers themselves, despite their fearsome reputation, suffered from chronic mechanical problems. The HL-230 engine was underpowered for the tank's weight. The final drive units frequently failed. After 100 of road march, operational readiness dropped precipitously. By contrast, the men of 4th Armored Division had been fighting since Normandy. They had learned, adapted, survived. They knew their Shermans could not win a frontal duel with a Panther, so they did not fight fair. September 19, the main German attack hit just after 7 in the morning. Fog covered the approach. German tank commanders, unable to navigate properly, advanced disorganized column along the main road. They expected to find a few American outposts, light resistance. They found Combat Command A waiting in prepared positions on the high ground. The Americans had advantages the Germans did not anticipate. Better radios, every Sherman could communicate with every other Sherman, and with the artillery batteries behind the lines. Better training. American tank crews practiced fire coordination until they could mass fires on a single target in seconds. Better intelligence. Reconnaissance had given Clarke exact locations of German assembly areas. And better terrain. The fields around offered long sight lines for the defenders, but the low ground near the roads turned into mud traps for the attackers. Sergeant William Bride commanded a Sherman in the 37th Tank Battalion. He watched through his periscope as the first Panthers emerged from the fog. 500 wide away, too close. The Panthers should have seen them by now, but the German crews were scanning the wrong ridge line. Bride did not wait for orders. He traversed right, aimed for the lead Panther's flank, and fired. The Sherman 75 gun could not penetrate a Panther's front, but the side armor was only 40 vertical. At 500 wide, it might as well have been paper. The first round punch through the Panther's side detonated the ammunition, and the German tank vanished in a column of flame. Before the second Panther could react, Bride's loader had rammed another round into the 6 seconds. Bride fired again, another flank shot, another kill. The remaining Panthers tried to deploy into combat formation, but they were on a narrow road with a ditch on one side and a hedger on the other. They had nowhere to go. American Shermans appeared on their flanks. Artillery began falling. Within 15 minutes, 9 Panthers lay burning. Survivors retreated. This was not how tank combat was supposed to work. Germans had better tanks. They should have won, but they had attacked into well-coordinated defense, lost the initiative, and paid the price. This was the pattern that would repeat itself over the next 11 days. The Germans would attack with superior vehicles, the Americans would use superior tactics. Combined arms, infantry support, artillery coordination. Airstrikes when the weather cleared, and every time the result was the same. The Shermans won. Over the course of the battle German forces lost 86. Tanks destroyed, 114 damaged or broken down. Of the 262 tanks, Fifth Panzer Army committed to the battle, only 62 remained operational by month's end. 4th Armored Division lost 41 tanks total during September, 25 of those losses belonged to Combat Command A, which bore the brunt of the German counter-offensive. The kill ratio was roughly 3-1 in favor of the Americans, against an enemy equipped with tanks that were on paper vastly superior. Reports from reached Eisenhower's headquarters within days. He read them with intense interest. Here was proof of what he had suspected. The Sherman's technical inferiority could be overcome by superior tactics, training and leadership, but it came at a cost. Every American tank destroyed meant 4 or 5 men killed or wounded. Every tank duel won at 5-1 odds meant accepting losses that would have been unthinkable against the earlier generation of German armor. Eisenhower called a meeting with his senior commanders. Was there Bradley, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The question on the table was simple: should the Allies accelerate production of the new M26 heavy tank, which mounted a 90mm gun capable of penetrating any German armor, or should they continue mass the Sherman, accepting the tactical limitations in exchange for overwhelming numbers? Spoke first. His position was clear. The Sherman was adequate, not ideal, not perfect, but adequate. He argued that tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks. Tanks were supposed to exploit breakthroughs, attack supply lines, disrupt enemy command and control. Tank destroyers would handle enemy armor, artillery would suppress it, air power would destroy it. The Sherman's real advantage was not firepower or armor, it was reliability, speed, and availability. Had numbers to support his argument. In September 1944, Third Army had advanced despite fuel shortages, despite determined German resistance, despite operating at the end of a 400-mile supply line. The Shermans kept running. They could be repaired in the field with parts canalized from other Shermans. They could be transported by rail without collapsing bridges. They could be crewed by men with a few weeks of training. The powerful as it was suffered from mechanical problems. It was heavier, requiring stronger bridges and more fuel. Production was ramping up slowly. If they switched production now, there would be months of reduced tank availability, months when the German army could rebuild its strength. Montgomery disagreed. British tank crews had faced Tigers and Panthers since North Africa. They had developed the Firefly, a Sherman variant, mounting the British 17 pounder gun specifically to counter German heavy armor. It worked, but there were never enough Fireflies. Montgomery argued for quality over quantity. Better to have fewer tanks that could win duels than masses of Shermans that relied on flanking maneuvers. Eisenhower listened to both arguments. Then he made his decision. Production would continue to focus on the Sherman, with gradual introduction of the M26 and accelerated deployment of Shermans mounting the 76mm gun. But more importantly, Eisenhower issued new tactical guidance to all armored units. Do not seek tank versus tank combat. Use combined arms, coordinate with infantry, mass artillery fires, call in strikes, use terrain, fight smart. This was the fundamental shift that came out of the analysis of German tanks and the battles of late 1944. The American army had entered Normandy believing that good tanks and brave men would win battles. By autumn, they understood that wars are won by systems. Systems of supply, systems of communication, systems of combined arms coordination. The Sherman was a component in that system, not the system itself. Took this guidance and refined it into doctrine that would define Third Army operations for the rest of the war. His tank commanders received explicit instructions: avoid frontal assaults against prepared positions, use reconnaissance to identify enemy strong points, coordinate with artillery before engaging. When encountering superior enemy armor, break contact and call for support. Use speed and maneuver to get into positions where American guns could penetrate enemy armor, flanks, rear tracks, engine compartments. The tactics worked. In October, Third Army began operations against the fortress city of the Germans defended with concrete bunkers. Minefields and Panthers, tankers did not charge the guns, they bypassed strong points, encircled defenders called in artillery to suppress positions, then advanced only when resistance had been broken. It took 7 weeks to capture Metz, longer than wanted, but he took the city. With acceptable losses, every Sherman saved was a Sherman that could fight. The next day in November the weather turned, rain, mud, the same conditions that had downed armies in the First World War. Sherman tanks with their narrow tracks struggled in soft ground, Panthers with wider tracks and lower ground pressure had better mobility in mud. This was a German advantage. Countered it by issuing extended end connectors called duck bills to widen Sherman tracks. It was a stopgap measure, not perfect, but it helped. By December, Third Army had reached the Saar River, the last natural barrier before the German industrial heartland, and then everything changed. December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West. 3 armies, 28 divisions, over 1,200 tanks including new King Tigers that weighed 70 tons and mounted 88 guns. The objective was. The result was the Battle of the Bulge. Eisenhower's response demonstrated everything the Allies had learned about armored warfare since Normandy. He did not order a headlong counterattack, he did not commit armor. He identified the shoulders of the German salient, held them firmly, then assembled overwhelming force for a coordinated counter-strike, and he called George. The meeting took place on December 19th. Eisenhower asked how quickly Third Army could disengage from its current operations, turn 90 north, and attack into the flank of the German offensive. His answer became legendary. 48 hours. He could have 3 divisions on the road in 48 hours. Eisenhower thought he was joking. He was not, had anticipated the crisis. His staff had prepared contingency plans for a withdrawal and redeployment. His logistics officers had stockpiled fuel and ammunition at forward depots. His tank units were ready to move. On December 22nd, the 4th Armored Division, the same unit that had fought at, began its march north toward 100 miles in winter weather over icy roads. They covered the distance in 3 days. On December 26th, lead elements of 4th Armored broke through German lines and reached the encircled paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. This was Eisenhower's vision of armored warfare made manifest. Not tanks dueling tanks in open fields, but armor as a mobile reserve capable of rapid redeployment, sustained by sophisticated logistics coordinated with infantry and artillery, supported by air power when weather permitted. The Sherman was perfect for this role, fast, reliable, produced in numbers that allowed commanders to accept losses and keep attacking. The counteroffensive against the Bulge demonstrated all the tactical adaptations that had evolved since Normandy. American tank commanders no longer sought to match German heavy armor in direct combat. They used terrain to close ranges before engaging. They coordinated with tank destroyers, which mounted heavier guns specifically designed for anti-tank work. They called in artillery to suppress enemy positions before advancing. They used infantry to screen approaches and protect flanks. They fought as a team, and the Germans, for all their technical superiority and tank design, could not match American operational tempo. Fifth Panzer Army advanced 30 mi in the first 3 days of the offensive, then stalled. Fuel shortages, traffic jams on narrow roads, American resistance at key crossroads, and when the weather cleared on December 23rd, American fighter bombers filled the skies. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, they attacked German columns, destroyed supply trucks, forced panzer divisions off the roads and into the forests where their heavy tanks struggled with mud and trees. By January, the Bulge had been reduced. German losses exceeded 100,000 men and 800 tanks. This last strategic reserve in the West had been destroyed, and the Allies prepared for the final push into Germany. Eisenhower reflected on the campaign in a letter to General George Marshall, his mentor and the Army Chief of Staff. He wrote about the Sherman controversy, the accusations from some quarters that American soldiers had been sent into battle with inferior equipment. Eisenhower rejected that narrative. He pointed out that the Sherman had proven itself in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany. It had fought in every theater, performed every mission, and while it was not invincible, it was good enough to win. But Eisenhower also acknowledged the human cost. every tank duel that American crews won. At 3-1 or 5-1 odds represented men who would not go home, families who would receive telegrams. The technical inferiority of the Sherman, however tactically manageable, had strategic implications. It shaped how battles were fought. It dictated casualty rates. It influenced the timetable of the war in the final analysis. What changed between June and December 1944 was not the Sherman tank itself. Upgraded models with 76mm guns arrived in numbers too small to make a decisive difference. The M26 reached units only in the war's final weeks. What changed was doctrine, understanding. The American army entered France believing that technological superiority would guarantee victory. They learned, through hard experience and careful analysis of captured German tanks, that victory belonged to the side that could integrate all its capabilities into a coherent systems. Third Army became the exemplar of this approach. His tank units did not seek fair fights, they sought advantageous engagements. They used speed to dictate terms. They used combined arms to multiply effectiveness. They used superior logistics to maintain tempo. They fought smart, not hard, and they won. The records from Metz, from the Bulge, all told the same story. When American tank units followed proper doctrine, coordinated with supporting arms, and used terrain intelligently, they defeated German armor even when outnumbered, and the kill ratios proved it. The casualty figures confirmed it. The advance of Allied forces from the to the demonstrated it. Eisenhower understood this better than most. His background included years working with tanks in the 1920s when the U.S. Army was developing armored doctrine. He had studied the German campaigns. Poland and France, he knew the theory. The Battle of the Bulge showed him the practice. The shoulders of the German salient held because American units, including armored units, followed the doctrine he had learned it decades earlier. Hold the shoulders, wait for reserves, concentrate force, counterattack decisively, and when that counterattack came, it was led by Sherman tanks. The same tanks that critics called inadequate, the same tanks that crews had learned to respect rather than rely on. The Shermans rolled into Bastion, pushed through though, crossed though, and advanced into Germany, not because they were the best tanks in the war, but because they were good enough, available in sufficient numbers, and employed by an army that had learned how to fight. His final push into Germany in March 1945 demonstrated the culmination of this tactical evolution. Third Army crossed the on March 22, seizing the bridge at before German engineers could destroy it. Armored columns fanned out across southern Germany, bypassing resistance, cutting lines of communication, encircling entire German armies. This was blitzkrieg in reverse, the Americans using German tactical concepts against their creators: exploitation, encirclement, shock. The Germans, fighting with their backs to their own borders, could not retreat into depth. Every kilometer lost was German territory, and the Americans kept rolling. The final tally of Third Army's operations in World War II was staggering. 6 countries liberated or occupied, 81,000 square miles of territory captured, more than 1 million German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and at the center of it all, the Sherman tank, the tank that should not have worked, the tank that won anyway. After the war, analysts examined the question that had haunted American tankers since Normandy. Could the Sherman match a Panther in combat? The answer, drawn from records of thousands of engagements, surprised many observers. In tank versus tank duels, properly employed Shermans achieved kill ratios of 3-1 against Panthers. Not because the Sherman was a better tank, but because American crews fought better. They had superior training. American tank crews received months of instruction before deploying. German crews, especially late in the war, received weeks. They had better logistics. When a Sherman was damaged, recovery vehicles brought it back for repair. When a Panther broke down, it was often abandoned for lack of spare parts or fuel. They had better coordination. American tank platoon could mass fire on a single target in seconds. German units, short of radios and trained coordinators, fought as individuals. They had better intelligence. American reconnaissance provided accurate information on enemy positions. German reconnaissance, stripped of resources and harassed by Allied air power, could not. Most importantly, American tankers understood what an Eisenhower had drilled into them: do not fight fair, use every advantage, terrain, air support, artillery, infantry numbers, fight smart, win. Go home. The Sherman tank was not the war-winning weapon some propagandists Claimed during the war, it was not the death trap that critics have sometimes portrayed. It was a tool, and like any tool, its effectiveness depended on how it was used, in the hands of poorly trained crews attacking against prepared positions. The Sherman was vulnerable in the hands of veterans, coordinated with combined arms employed. According to sound doctrine, the Sherman was lethal. That was the lesson Eisenhower learned from studying captured German tanks and analyzing the battles of 1944. Technology matters, training matters, logistics matter, but doctrine matters most. An inferior tank used properly will defeat a superior tank used poorly. Every time. If you found this deep dive into the tactical evolution of American armored doctrine valuable, please consider subscribing. We tell the stories of the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Innovations, the adaptations, the men who learned from their mistakes and turned defeat into victory. These are the stories that shaped modern warfare. The story of the Sherman and the Panther is not a simple tale of good versus evil or superior versus inferior. It is a story about learning, about adaptation, about organizations that could analyze their own failures, identify solutions, and implement changes quickly enough to matter. The American army that entered combat Normandy in June 1944 was not the same army that crossed the in March 1945. They had learned, paid for that education in blood, and emerged as the most effective ground force the United States had ever fielded. Eisenhower's role in this transformation is often overlooked. He was not a battlefield commander. He never led a tank charge or directed a division in combat, but he understood systems. He understood that wars are won by organizations that can learn faster than their enemies, and he fostered a culture of adaptation throughout the Allied command structure. When reports from the front indicated problems, he listened. When testing revealed flaws, he demanded solutions. When doctrine proved inadequate, he authorized changes, implemented those changes with characteristic aggression. His Third Army became the testing ground for new tactics, new techniques, new approaches to combined arms warfare. Not all of his innovations worked. Some were brilliant, some were reckless, but all of them reflected a willingness to experiment, to take risks, to try something different if the old methods were not working. That willingness to adapt more than any technical specification or production number determined the outcome of the war. In Europe, the captured German tanks that Eisenhower ordered analyzed in 1944 revealed more than just armor thickness and gun performance. They revealed a different philosophy of warfare. German doctrine emphasized quality, superior individual weapons, better trained specialists, elite units. The assumption was that a small number of excellent tanks crewed by highly trained soldiers could defeat a larger number of inferior vehicles. For a time, that assumption held true, but it rested on a fragile foundation. Quality takes time, training takes time, production of complex systems takes time, and by 1944, Germany had run out of time. American doctrine, refined through the experiences of 1944, emphasized quantity and system integration. Adequate tanks produced in overwhelming numbers, crews trained to a standard, not an impossible one, logistics capable of sustaining continuous operations, combined arms coordination, that the effectiveness of each individual weapon. The result was an army that could absorb losses, learn lessons, and keep attacking. An army that measured success not in kill ratios but in territory captured, enemies encircled, strategic objectives achieved. The numbers tell the story. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks during the entire war. America produced 50,000 Shermans. Germany's production peaked in 1944 and then collapsed as Allied bombing destroyed factories and cut supply lines. American production increased every year, limited only by shipping capacity and the need to produce other equipment. By the time the war ended, American tank parks in Europe held thousands of Shermans waiting for crews. German tank parks were empty. This disparity reflected different strategic realities. Germany fought a defensive war on multiple fronts, trying to hold territory against enemies who outnumbered and outproduced them. Quality was their only option. America fought an offensive war, projecting power across oceans into theaters thousands of miles from home. Quantity and reliability were essential. The Sherman suited American needs perfectly. It could be shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded at ports, driven to the front, and employed effectively by crews who had been civilians 6 months earlier. The Panther could do none of those things, but acknowledging the Shermans Strategic suitability does not diminish the courage of the men who crewed them. They knew they knew that a Panther could kill them. From beyond effective retaliation range, they climbed into their tanks anyway. They closed the range, they flanked, they fought, and most importantly, they learned. Sergeant Bride, who killed 2 Panthers in the first 15 minutes of combat, survived the war. He came home. Decades later, historians interviewed him about his experiences. He remembered the fear, the tension, the split second when he saw the Panthers emerge from the fog and realized his crew had maybe 30 seconds to fire before German gunners spotted them. He also remembered the training, the countless hours of practice loading, aiming, firing, moving, coordinating, so that when the moment came, when his life depended on doing everything exactly right, muscle memory took over. He aimed, he fired. He lived. That was real achievement in the autumn of 1944. Not tactical brilliance, though he had that, not aggressive leadership, though he provided that too. His achievement was creating a learning organization. Third Army fought 26 major engagements between August and December 1944. After each one, staff compiled reports: what worked, what failed, what needed to change. Those reports went to division commanders who adjusted tactics, to supply officers who modified procedures, to training centers back in the United States where new crews learned from the experiences of men already in combat. The cycle of action, analysis, and adaptation continued throughout the war. It gave American forces an advantage that German technical superiority could not overcome. The ability to learn faster than the enemy could adapt. Eisenhower recognized this when he wrote his final report on European operations. He noted that the campaign had been won not by any single weapon or tactic, but by an integrated system of capabilities that reinforced each other. Air superiority allowed ground forces to maneuver without fear of air attack. Naval dominance ensured uninterrupted supply across the Atlantic. Industrial capacity provided replacement equipment faster than it could be destroyed. Training programs produced competent soldiers in numbers sufficient to maintain offensive operations despite casualties. And at the tactical level, combined arms doctrine allowed even units to defeat technically superior enemies through coordination and teamwork. The Sherman tank was one component of that system, perhaps not the best component, certainly not the most feared by the enemy, but adequate, good enough, and in war good enough is often all you need. The perfect tank unavailable. Sufficient numbers or too unreliable to operate effectively wins nothing. Adequate tank available in thousands, crewed by trained soldiers, supported by logistics and doctrine, wins wars. This principle extends beyond tanks. Beyond World War II, it is a fundamental truth about military effectiveness that remains relevant today. Organizations that can learn, adapt, and integrate multiple capabilities into coherent systems will defeat organizations that rely solely on technical superiority. Victory belongs not to the best equipment, but to the best employed equipment. Understood this instinctively. Eisenhower understood it analytically. Together, they shaped the American way of war that emerged from World War II and defined military doctrine for generations: combined arms, overwhelming logistics, tactical flexibility, continuous adaptation. These concepts, refined in the fields of France and the forests of Belgium, became the foundation of modern military practice, and it all began with a simple question. Why are our tanks losing to their tanks? The answer led to captured vehicles, hauled to testing facilities, serial numbers recorded and analyzed, armor plates measured, penetration tests conducted, intelligence estimates revised, tactical guidance rewritten, training programs updated, soldiers taught new techniques, battles fought differently, and gradually, incrementally, victory achieved. The legacy of this process endures. Every modern military studies the campaigns of 1944, not for the equipment involved, but for the methods used. How did the Allies identify problems so quickly? How did they implement solutions across multiple armies operating in different sectors? How did they maintain the pace of operations while simultaneously adapting tactics? These are questions of institutional learning, organizational culture, and leadership. They have no easy answers, but the example of Eisenhower analyzing German tanks, Patton refining tactics, and American tankers fighting smarter instead of harder provides a template. In March 1945, when Third Army crossed the Aisne, began its final drive into Germany, Sherman tanks led the advance. They had the same armor they started with, the same basic gun, the same limitations, but they were employed differently, fought differently. And they won, not despite their limitations, but because their crews and commanders had learned to work within those limitations and still achieve victory. By May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the question that had haunted Eisenhower in July 1944 had been answered, not with a new tank, not with a technological miracle, but with doctrine, with training, with adaptation. The Sherman tank was good enough because the men who crewed it, the officers who commanded it, and the system that supported it had become excellent. That was the real change that captured German Panzers helped reveal, not that American tanks needed better guns or thicker armor, though those things would have been welcome, but that American forces needed better tactics, better coordination, better employment of the capabilities they already possessed. Once that lesson was learned and applied, the outcome was never in doubt. The Sherman would roll into Berlin long before any Panther rolled into London. On behalf of everyone who has served, everyone who has studied this history, everyone who believes these stories matter, thank you for watching. If you found this examination of tactical adaptation and institutional learning valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We bring you the history that shaped our world, told with accuracy and respect for the men who lived it. Second World War was not won by superior technology alone. It was won by superior adaptation, by organizations that could learn from their mistakes faster than their enemies could exploit them, by leaders who understood that doctrine matters more than equipment, and by soldiers who fought with courage, intelligence, and determination even when the odds seemed impossible. That is the lesson of Eisenhower and the Sherman tank. That is the story that deserves to be told. And that is the legacy that continues to shape military thinking 80 years later. The war in Europe ended not because the Allies had the best tanks, but because they had the best army, an army that could learn, an army that could adapt, an army that could win.